Day 6, pleasure and satisfaction around food and eating. We've already looked at food rules and they play a major part in this. You know, if you have food rules, especially around the good and bad food list, that is going to have a significant impact on the amount of pleasure and satisfaction that you get from food and from eating. So food is not just there for nutrition. Food is there to be enjoyed. You know, it hugely forms part of our culture. You know, we show love with food. You know, so to think that food is just there for fuel is totally unrealistic. You know, of course, that is a big part of why we eat. You know, we eat to fuel our bodies, to give ourselves energy, but it is so important that we get pleasure and satisfaction from food. And it's really hard to get that pleasure and satisfaction if we're too busy feeling guilty and beating ourselves up about what we should or shouldn't be eating. And even if you're not overtly adhering to those food rules, the chances are they are going on in the unconscious mind, and there is a level of guilt and shame associated to eating. And it won't be all the time. There'll be lots of times where you eat and you can really allow yourself to enjoy what you're eating and gain pleasure from it and enjoy that satisfaction. It's a bit like, you know, if you go out for a really nice meal, because someone else has cooked it, and often maybe it's food that you haven't eaten before. It's the whole experience that is really pleasurable and satisfying. You know, I know there's times where I will go out and I'll actually eat a relatively small amount of food, but the pleasure I get from that food is huge. And then there'll be other times where I have a great big plate of food and there's very, very little pleasure and satisfaction that have actually come from it. So yesterday we looked at hunger and fullness cues. So that is such a fundamental part of building trust with food. And again, you know, this is something that when I'm running my 12-week program, is such an important part of it, because it's so easy to just slip back into those old patterns of being busy or of overriding our hunger. You know, diet culture is really fascinating, because especially when we're calorie counting, if the diet says we should be eating 1,200 calories a day and we tend to do a lot of our eating in the evening, you can see how we start to either skip meals in the day or we eat very, very little in the day. And of course, what starts to happen when we're not eating through the day, it's no wonder we're starving by the time we get home. And that's often when we then overeat. And that cycle just keeps repeating itself. So there is lots and lots of research and evidence that supports that the more we start to eat more regularly through the day and sustain ourselves, you know, we are designed to eat little and often. If you go back to the cavemen days, you know, they wouldn't have just eaten the way we do now. You know, it's our busy lifestyles. It's, you know, we've moved away from like eating like a king for breakfast, a queen for lunch, and a prince for evening meals. That was something I very much remember growing up, but we so unaligned to that nowadays. And I've made that big shift in the last couple of years where I really start to eat to my hunger, and I eat little and often. And if I compared that to how I used to eat 10 years ago, it's so different. And you know, I never allow myself to get to more than about a 4 or 5 hungry, because I know I definitely am hangry, you know, and some of you might relate to that. You know, I get really angry if I get to that 7, 8, 9 point, and then I feel like the Tasmanian devil, where I'm like going around the kitchen just grabbing what I can. So keep working on your hunger and fullness cues. So back to today, pleasure and satisfaction. Couple of questions to start with that you're going to ask, as always, as a workbook. Couple of questions to ask about your current relationship with pleasure and satisfaction around food. Then I am going to talk about 3 key areas that are really helpful to help build something I call joyful eating. You know, it's so important. You know, food is wonderful and it's there to be enjoyed. But when we've got all of this like diet culture stuff going on behind us, we really don't allow ourselves that joy. You know, I hear it so many times with my clients. It's almost like food is the crime, and the beating ourselves up is the punishment. And as long as we're beating ourselves up for eating the food, it's kind of, we're okay, and we keep going on that cycle, and it massively influences our self-doubt and our trust around food. So the three key things that I believe are so powerful in building a joyful relationship with food. The first one is eating before we get too hungry, and that ties into yesterday's task. The next one is letting go of food guilt, and I am going to talk more about that in tomorrow's activity, where we're going to look at mindset around food, and we're going to touch on guilt. And the next one is mindfulness, and that's what we're going to look at today. But we're not going to, there's kind of two sides to mindfulness. You've got the sitting down and being more mindful as you're eating, but our experience of eating and tasting starts way before the food is even on our plate, and that's the bit that I want to focus on with you guys today. So before we move on to the exercise today, there is a questionnaire for you to fill out, and it's just I think there's 15 questions there that are kind of just around mindfulness, but also around your eating. As always, when you answer the questions, try not to judge the answers that are coming up. This one's not a yes and no. This is like you've got 4 options: almost always, frequently, infrequently, and almost never. So I think there's 15 questions there. Just kind of go and give them a rating 1 to 4, depending on what your answer is. And then spend a bit of time. The next part is spend a bit of time reflecting on those questions. What have you noticed by the answers that have come out for you? And how does that feed into the amount of pleasure and satisfaction that you currently get from eating? Okay. Then we are going to do a sensory consideration experiment. So I had to look at my notes there because my mind went blank. So yes, a sensory consideration experiment. Basically all that means is actually stopping and pausing before you eat to ask yourself a number of questions around what you really fancy eating. So that is going to be your experiment for today, and it's one of those experiments that are going to kind of just get you to slow down with your choices around what you're eating. Again, it's one of those things, isn't it? Especially if we're busy, we recognise that we're hungry and we'll just go and grab something out the fridge, or we might take time to make ourselves something. But how often do we actually take time to pause in that moment and think to ourselves, what is it I really fancy? And that's what I want you to work on today. So it's a little experiment. Choose a meal time. As I said yesterday, choose a time maybe where there's not lots and lots of people around. So you've got a quiet environment in which to practice this experiment. There's nothing worse than like trying to setting yourself up, trying to do something, and then you get interrupted by the kids or a call or something like that. So that might be breakfast, that might be lunch, it might be your evening meal, whatever works for you. So then what I invite you to do is before you eat, I want you to just press pause and give some consideration to what taste do you fancy. There's some prompts that are outlined in your workbook. So really think about the taste. Do you want sweet? Do you want savoury? Do you want salty? What texture do you fancy? Do you fancy crunchy? Do you fancy smooth? What smells do you fancy? Smell is a really underrated sense, and yet if you think how much the power of smell has, if you go to the supermarkets, they're pumping smells into the supermarket, aren't they, to get us to buy. So what smells? So in that moment of pause, think about what taste do you want, what texture, what smells would really invite pleasure. What temperature? Do you want hot food? Do you want cold food? Do you want icy food? What temperature do you fancy? And how do you want your food to look? I am a massive appearance food. Even if I'm having something really quick, I will put it on a certain plate, and I will make it look pretty. Gary will often laugh and scoff at me for doing that, but it's really important. It's part of my mindfulness practice. Not only do I think about what it looks like, I also think about my environment, and it's not uncommon for me to actually sit at the table and put a place setting down. I don't do it all the time, but these for me represent really nice self-care, indulgent activities. So when we start to think about bringing pleasure and satisfaction around food, it's not just about the food we're eating itself. The environment is really important as well. But for this exercise, I just want you to think about, before you're eating, those sensory considerations. What do you want it to taste like? What texture do you fancy? What smells? What temperature do you want? What appearance do you want your food to have? So it's really about just slowing down and giving some consideration to what it is you really want to eat. Because when we start eating the foods we really fancy, guess what happens? We get more pleasure and we get more satisfaction from eating them. And the knock-on effect, when we're actually enjoying foods and taking time to consider what it is we really want to eat, the whole eating and pleasurable, the eating experience becomes more satisfactory and pleasurable, and that reduces guilt. And when we reduce guilt, that starts to build trust around food. The last thing to do today is to then, once you've tried this experiment, go and just do a bit of reflection on it. Reflection is really powerful because it gives us an opportunity to think about how something has gone from us, what we've learned from it, you know, what come up for us that we weren't expecting, how did we find the experience, and is it something that changes the more that you do it. So spend a bit of time after you've done it, come and share in the group how you found the experience. What did you notice? Did by slowing down and going through these things and then eating what you really fancied, what knock-on effect did that have on your fullness levels? Did you eat less? Did you eat more? Were you much more aware of what you were eating? I'm fascinated. So try the experiment and then come and tell us how you get on.